Your grandmother did this before she even took her coat off. She'd come home from the bank, if she trusted the bank at all, and the first thing she did wasn't put away the groceries. It was split the cash, a little behind the flour tin, a little sewn into the lining of a coat nobody wore anymore, a little folded so small it disappeared into the seam of a mattress. Not because she was strange, not because she didn't understand money, because she understood it better than we do. And what she understood is this: the place you're told is the safest place to keep your money can fail. Completely, overnight, with your name on a piece of paper that suddenly means nothing. Today, we don't even carry cash long enough to hide it. Money moves in a tap, a notification, a buy now, pay later button that shows up at checkout for a $14 candle. We've built a financial life with almost no friction between wanting something and owning it, and almost no memory of what it looked like when the whole system that makes that possible simply stopped working. She had that memory. She built her entire relationship with money around never being surprised by it again. And somewhere along the way, we lost every single one of the habits that protected her. So here are 25 of them. The real ones. The ones her generation used to stay out of debt, out of banks they didn't trust, and out of a system that, then just as now, was never built to protect the person holding the smallest amount of money in the room. Trick #1. She banked at home. 2. Picture a line outside a bank in the winter of 1931. Not a line of customers making deposits. A line of people who'd heard a rumor the night before and hadn't slept since. They're not dressed for standing outside this long. Somebody's holding a passbook like it's the only proof their life savings ever existed. And by the time the doors finally open, for some of them, it already doesn't matter. The money's gone. Not stolen, just gone. Swallowed into a failure nobody at the counter can explain to a family that trusted them with everything they had. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 9,000 banks failed across the United States, roughly a third of every bank in the country closing its doors, taking an estimated $1.3 billion in deposits down with them. There was no safety net yet, no insurance, no promise that your money would still exist tomorrow just because it existed today. The FDIC, the guarantee we now take completely for granted, wasn't created until 1933, specifically because so many families had already learned the hard way that it didn't exist. So they adapted. Hundreds of thousands of households started keeping a working portion of their money at home. Not because they'd given up on banking entirely, but because they refused to hand over control of every dollar to an institution they could no longer fully trust. We call it mattress money now, almost like a joke. It wasn't a joke. It was a rational response to watching the alternative fail in real time. We keep our entire financial life inside a single app today, protected by a password and a company's server uptime. She kept a portion of hers where she could see it, touch it, and never wonder if it still existed. If you take one thing from this list, before we even get to number 2, know exactly where your money is, and never let all of it live in one place you don't fully control. Trick #2. She never trusted one hiding place. Here's the part people get wrong about mattress money. It usually wasn't just the mattress. Families who'd lived through a bank failure rarely made the mistake of trusting a single hiding spot the same way they'd trusted a single bank. Accounts from the era, and the coins and bills still turning up in old floorboards and wall cavities today, describe a habit of spreading savings across several places at once. A tin in the pantry, a jar buried in the yard, a few bills folded into a book nobody else would open. If one hiding place was discovered, robbed, or simply forgotten, the whole household wasn't wiped out at once. It's the same instinct behind not putting all your money in one bank, just scaled down to the size of a kitchen. Diversification wasn't a Wall Street word to her. It was common sense learned from watching what happens when you don't practice it. We do the opposite now without noticing. One bank, one card, one app that touches almost every dollar we earn and spend. If that app goes down for a day, plenty of us genuinely don't know how we'd pay for dinner. She would have found that terrifying, not because she distrusted technology, but because she never let convenience talk her out of a backup plan. I'll be honest, writing this one made me check how many of my own passwords protect money I couldn't reach in 5 minutes if the power went out. The answer wasn't comforting. So let's talk about how she handled the thing that got so many families into trouble before the crash ever happened: signing for things she didn't fully understand. Trick #3. She read every word before she signed anything. Go back just a few years earlier, to a porch in the late 1920s, and there's a salesman standing on it with a radio, or a washing machine, or an icebox nobody in the house has ever owned before. He's not asking for the full price. He's asking for a little down, and a little every month, and that offer is everywhere. By the end of the 1920s, roughly 2/3 of automobiles, over 70% of furniture, 80% of household appliances, and up to 90% of pianos and musical instruments in America were being bought this exact way: on time, in installments, on credit that felt less like debt and more like modern convenience. That's the part that gets lost. Easy credit isn't a modern invention. It was already everywhere before the Depression hit, and when incomes collapsed, it was the households carrying those installment contracts who got hit hardest, losing goods they'd half paid for and owed money on regardless. The generation that lived through that didn't come out the other side trusting a payment plan, just because it made the number look smaller. She read every clause. She asked what happened if a payment was missed. She asked what the real total cost was, added up, before she signed a single line, and more often than not, she walked away and saved for the full price instead. We do the opposite now, in about 4 seconds at checkout. 4 payments of $12.50. Sounds like nothing. It rarely gets read as what it actually is: a debt contract, dressed up as a convenience feature. Before your next purchase offers to split itself into payments, do what she did. Say the real total number out loud, once, before you agree to anything. Trick #4. She said no to the payment plan, even when it was free. There's a moment that would look almost strange to us now. A family standing in a store, being offered exactly what they came for: a stove, a bedroom set, a sewing machine, on terms that sound generous. A little down, a little a month, take it home today. And they say no. Not because they can't technically manage the payments. Because they've decided, as a rule, that they don't buy what they can't pay for in full, and they'd rather leave the store empty-handed and come back in 6 months with the whole amount in cash. That sounds almost irrational to a modern ear. Why turn down a plan that costs you nothing extra? But that generation had watched what installment debt did when the ground shifted. When incomes fell after 1929, the households carrying those generous payment plans didn't just lose the item, they lost every payment they'd already made on it, and often still owed money on furniture being hauled back out the door. The lesson stuck. A payment you can afford today is still a promise made to a future you can't see. Today, the plan is the default, not the exception. Buy now, pay later is pre-selected at checkout. 0% financing is framed as free money, as if the only cost of debt were interest. She knew better. The cost of debt is that it assumes tomorrow looks like today, and her whole life had taught her that it doesn't. The next time a purchase offers to become 4 easy payments, ask yourself her question: Not can I afford the payment, but can I afford this, right now, in full? If the answer is no, that's your answer. Trick #5. She kept the bank at arm's length. Not everyone abandoned banks. That's the myth. Plenty of families kept an account, but they changed what they used it for. Instead of trusting the bank with everything, they trusted it with the minimum. Enough to function, to cash a check, to handle what had to be handled on paper. The rest stayed under their own control. The bank became a tool they used deliberately, not a vault they surrendered their whole life to. That's a subtle shift, but it's the whole difference in mindset. To us, the bank, or the app, is simply where money lives. All of it, by default, without a second thought. To her, after 1933, the bank was one place among several, and never the one holding everything. She'd seen what everything in one place cost the family down the street. You don't have to distrust your bank to borrow this habit. You just have to stop treating any single institution as the automatic home for every dollar you have. A working account for what moves, a reserve you control for what shouldn't. That separation is exactly what she practiced, decades before anyone called it a financial strategy. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. Writing these, none of this was sophisticated. She wasn't reading market analysis. She'd simply been burned badly enough to never confuse convenient with safe again. And that one distinction did more for her family's security than most of what passes for financial advice today. Which brings us to the money she kept that nobody else knew about. Trick Shack 6. She kept money that was only hers. On farms across the country, there was a kind of money that ran on its own quiet track, and it usually belonged to the woman of the house. They called it egg money. A farm wife raised the hens, gathered the eggs, sold them in town, and kept what came back. It trickled in slowly, a few coins at a time, which is exactly why it got dismissed as small, and exactly why it mattered. That slow trickle of cash often bought the food and necessities a family would otherwise have gone without, especially when the harvest money was gone and the winter was long. This wasn't secrecy for its own sake. In an era when a wife often had little formal control over the household's main income, egg money was hers by right, earned, managed, and spent on her own judgment. It was independence, measured in dimes. And in a hard year, that separate little stream could be the thing that carried a family between the lean months, precisely because it hadn't been pooled into the one pot that ran dry. We've mostly lost the idea of money that is genuinely, structurally your own, separate, self-managed, answerable to no shared budget. Everything gets merged now, automated, swept into one account. There's real value in the merge. But there was real wisdom in her version too. A small stream of money you fully control, that doesn't depend on anyone else's paycheck or decisions, can be the difference between weathering a bad stretch and being trapped in one. You don't need a chicken coop. You need one pool of money that is unmistakably, independently yours. Trick #7. She traded before she borrowed. When cash dried up, she didn't reach for a lender. She reached for whatever she could trade. And this wasn't a fringe survival tactic. It was organized. In 1931, an exchange opened in Salt Lake City to let unemployed people barter their labor directly for surplus farm produce, and the idea spread fast across the country. By 1932, a National Development Association was issuing paper scrip that represented the value of goods or services you'd provided, accepted by shops, traders, even theaters. A blacksmith took payment in potatoes. A mechanic fixed a car for a week of meals. Value changed hands without a dollar or a loan touching it. The instinct underneath it is the one we've most completely lost. When you need something, the first question isn't, how do I finance this? It's, what do I already have that I could trade for it? Skills, time, things you own and aren't using. She saw all of that as currency, because it was. We jump straight to borrowing now. Financing a purchase before it ever occurs to us that we might trade, swap, or do it ourselves. Before your next, how do I pay for this? Try her question first. What do I already have that's worth something to someone else? You'll be surprised how often the answer means you never needed the loan at all. Trick #8. She paid in cash and felt every dollar. There's a reason cash mattered to her in a way that goes deeper than distrust of banks. When you pay in physical money, you feel the transaction. You count the bills into someone's hand. You watch the stack in your wallet get thinner. The money resists you a little on the way out. And that resistance is exactly the point. She paid cash for nearly everything, not just because credit was risky, but because cash told her the truth about her spending in real time, every single time. That's not nostalgia. It's a fact about how spending works. And it's been the quiet observation behind decades of household budgeting wisdom. Physical money forces you to see what spending actually looks like. When the grocery cash ran out, dinner became whatever was already in the pantry. There was no, just this once on a card. No catching up next month. The empty wallet was the whole conversation, and it ended the argument before it started. We've spent a generation engineering that friction away. Tap to pay. One-click checkout. A number on a screen that never feels like anything leaving your hand, because nothing does. The convenience is real, but so is the cost. Study after study finds people spend more when the money is abstract. You don't have to go all cash, but try running one category, groceries, eating out, whatever tends to slip, on physical money for a month. You'll feel exactly what she felt, and you'll spend differently because of it. Trick #9. She never bought what she couldn't pay off that month. Here was the rule, and it was almost absolute. If you couldn't pay for it in full within the month you bought it, you didn't buy it. Not, you financed it carefully. You didn't buy it. The purchase waited until the money existed. That single rule quietly ruled out nearly every form of consumer debt before it could ever start, because it collapsed the entire question of, can I make the payments, back into one honest question. Do I have the money right now, or don't I? It sounds austere. In practice, it was freeing. A household living by that rule never woke up owing anyone for something already worn out, eaten, or forgotten. There was no such thing as still paying in June for a mistake made in March. Whatever they owned clean. Now flip it to today. The average household carries a rotating balance of purchases it's still paying for, long after the thrill is gone. Dinners digested months ago, gadgets already outdated, still quietly charging interest. Her rule is the cure, and it's brutally simple. If you can't clear it this month, it isn't a purchase yet. It's a loan. Treat it like one, and most of the time you'll find you'd rather just wait. I want to slow down for a second, because it's easy to hear all this as scolding, and it isn't. She wasn't more disciplined than us because she was a better person. She was more disciplined because the alternative had a face she'd seen. Every one of these habits is really the same lesson wearing different clothes. Here's what that lesson looked like on her kitchen table. Trick #10. She gave every dollar a job before it was spent. Walk into her kitchen, and you might find a row of containers, coffee cans, mason jars, labeled tins, envelopes tucked in a drawer, and each one had a purpose written on it, or understood without writing. Rent here, food there, one for the doctor, one that never got touched no matter what. When money came in, It didn't go into one undifferentiated pile to be spent down until it ran out. It got divided first, on the way in, before a single dollar had a chance to wander. This is the whole principle behind the envelope method that budgeting experts still teach today. And she was running it with actual tin cans decades before it had a name or an app. The genius of it is that it makes overspending physically visible. The rent can is the rent can. You don't borrow from it for something else, because you can see the rent leaving if you do. Every dollar had a job before it was spent, so no dollar got spent by accident. We've digitized this into abstraction. Everything pools in one account, and we try to keep the boundaries in our heads while a dozen automatic charges quietly cross them. Her system worked precisely because it lived outside her head, in physical containers she couldn't fool. You can rebuild it in about 10 minutes, separate accounts, labeled envelopes, whatever's physical enough to be honest. Give every dollar a job the moment it arrives, and it stops disappearing on you. Trick #11. She made the want wait. When she wanted something that wasn't strictly necessary, a better coat, a nicer set of dishes, a small luxury, she didn't buy it and figure out the money after. She named the price, and then she waited until she had that full amount set aside, in hand, before she'd let herself buy. The waiting wasn't punishment, it was a filter. Half the things she thought she wanted quietly stopped mattering somewhere in the weeks it took to save for them, and the money she'd set aside was still hers. That delay did something our instant world has almost erased. It put time between the wanting and the owning, and time is where most bad purchases die. A craving that survives 6 weeks of saving is probably a real desire. A craving that evaporates in 3 was never worth the money, and under her system, it never cost her any. We've built the exact opposite machine. See it, want it, own it, before the feeling fades. That's the entire design of modern commerce. And pay later exists specifically to erase the weight she used on purpose. So use hers on purpose too. For anything non-essential, name the full price and make it wait until you've saved every dollar of it. You'll buy less, you'll owe nothing, and the things you do buy will be the ones that actually mattered. Trick, she talked the price down before she ever split it up. When something cost more than she wanted to pay, she had a move, and it wasn't reaching for a payment plan. It was asking, "Is that your best price? Is there anything wrong with it I should know about? Would you take a little less if I pay you cash today?" Haggling wasn't rude in her world, and it wasn't beneath her. It was simply the normal opening of a transaction, the expected first step, and a cash buyer, who could pay in full on the spot, held real leverage a financed buyer never has. That's the piece we've forgotten. When you finance a purchase, you've quietly given up all your bargaining power. The seller knows you're focused on the monthly number, not the total, and the total is where they make their money. She kept her power by keeping the conversation about the whole price, paid now, in cash. The lower price was the reward for not needing credit. We've been trained to treat prices as fixed and payments as flexible, which is exactly backwards from how she operated. Big-ticket prices are far more negotiable than most people believe. On appliances, cars, medical bills, furniture, services of every kind. Before you ever let something get sliced into installments, try her step first. Ask for a better price, in cash, today. The worst they say is no, and you've lost nothing. Often they say yes, and you've saved more than any 0% plan would have pretended to give you. Trick #13. She kept a fund she would not touch. Somewhere in that row of labeled containers was one that operated under a different law than all the others. It could be small, sometimes painfully small, a few coins added when there were coins to spare. But it had one absolute rule attached to it. You do not touch this unless the roof is coming down. Not for a sale, not for a want, not for a rough week that wasn't quite an emergency. The whole power of that fund lived in the fact that it was never, ever rated for anything less than true disaster. She understood something we constantly talk ourselves out of. An emergency fund only works if it's genuinely untouchable. The moment emergency starts to include a good deal or a tight but survivable month, it stops being a safety net and becomes just another spending account with a nicer name. She held the line precisely because she'd lived through the kind of year where that small, protected pile was the only thing standing between her family and catastrophe. Today, the safety net for most households is a credit card, which is to say, the plan for an emergency is to go into debt at the worst possible moment, when income is least reliable and interest hurts most. Her way was the reverse. Face the emergency with money you already own, so a bad event doesn't also become a debt you carry for years. Start one now, keep it small if that's all you can manage, and then defend it like she did. Nothing touches it but a real disaster. I keep noticing how much of this comes down to one quiet act of defiance, putting something away before life has a chance to claim it. That instinct wasn't invented in the 1930s. It was already written down, in a little book her generation could have read brand new. Trick #14. She paid herself before she paid anyone else. The rule was simple, and she followed it in the hardest years imaginable. When money came in, a portion went to savings first, off the top, before rent, before bills, before food money got divided into its cans. Not whatever happened to be left at the end of the month, because she knew the truth about whatever's left. There's never anything left. Money left unassigned always finds somewhere to go. So she assigned it to herself first, and lived on the rest. This wasn't folk instinct alone. It was in the air of her era. In 1926, a book called The Richest Man in Babylon put the idea into a single famous phrase: pay yourself first, and taught setting aside at least 1/10 of everything you earn before anything else has a claim on it. It sold in the millions and shaped how a whole generation thought about saving. The principle was almost aggressively simple. A part of all you earn is yours to keep, but only if you take it out before the rest gets spent. We've inverted it completely. We pay the landlord, the lender, the subscriptions, the app charges, and ourselves dead last, with whatever survives, which is usually nothing. Her order was deliberate. Self first, everyone else after. Automate it if you have to, the way she did it by hand. Move a set amount to savings the day money arrives, before you've had the chance to spend $1 of it. Even a small percentage, taken first and never touched, will quietly outperform every good intention you've ever had about saving what's left. Trick #15. She sold and reused before she spent savings. When the household needed money or needed a thing, dipping into savings was close to the last resort, not the first. Before that, she looked at what she already had, something to sell, something to fix instead of replace, something to repurpose into what was needed. The worn sheet became rags, then the rags became stuffing. The jars got reused until they broke. Nearly nothing left the house as garbage, while it still held any use or any value at all, because in her mind, every usable object was money she hadn't spent yet. That's a different relationship with ownership than we have. To her, the things you already owned were a kind of second savings account, one you could draw on by selling, mending, or repurposing before ever touching actual cash. The stuff had value beyond its first use, and using it up completely was simply respect for money already spent. We throw away staggering amounts of usable value, and then spend fresh money to replace it, often buying back the exact thing we just discarded. Her habit closes that leak. Before you spend savings on something new, run her checklist. Can I fix what I have, sell something I don't use, or repurpose something already here? The money you don't spend is worth exactly as much as the money you earn, and a lot easier to come by. Trick #16. She grew part of what she ate. The garden wasn't a hobby, and it wasn't charming. It was a second income that happened to grow in the backyard. Every row of potatoes, every jar of beans put up for winter, was money that didn't have to be earned, borrowed, or handed to a store. A direct reduction in how much cash the household needed just to eat. And the numbers behind it were real. By 1934, roughly 70,000 subsistence gardens were producing an estimated $2.8 million worth of food for families on relief. And that only counts the organized relief plots. It doesn't touch the countless private backyard gardens feeding families who never showed up in any statistic at all. The logic was simple, and it was powerful. The less of your survival that depends on cash, the less vulnerable you are when cash gets scarce. Food you grow can't be taken away by a bank failure or a lost job. It's the one part of the budget that answers to weather and effort instead of income. In a decade when income was the least reliable thing in the world, that mattered enormously. We've outsourced nearly every calorie we eat to a supply chain we don't control and can't see, and we call that progress, until the price of everything jumps, and we remember how exposed that leaves us. You don't need a farm to borrow her thinking. Even a few pots of herbs, a tomato plant, a small bed of greens shaves something real off the grocery bill and puts one small piece of your survival back under your own roof. She'd tell you to start with whatever you can, because every bit you grow is a bit the world can't overcharge you for. Trick #17. She treated debt as something to be ashamed of. This one is hard for us to even feel anymore, because we've lost the emotion entirely. To her, owing money wasn't a neutral financial tool. It was close to a private disgrace. Something you didn't discuss, didn't take on lightly, and worked frantically to get out from under, if you ever found yourself in it. Being in debt meant you'd failed to live within what you had. It meant someone else had a claim on your labor and your name. The shame wasn't irrational. It was a powerful break, and it kept people out of trouble that easy comfort, with debt, walks us straight into. Now, there's a real cost to that shame too, and it's worth being honest about it. It could be cruel to people who fell into debt through no fault of their own, through illness or disaster, or simply being poor. This isn't a call to go back to shaming people, but somewhere between her generation's harsh stigma and our own total comfort, we lost the useful part, the instinct that debt is serious, that it's not the normal default state of a healthy life, that it should feel like a weight worth escaping, rather than a background hum you stop hearing. Today, debt is just the water we swim in, a balance on everything, normalized, even celebrated as savvy. Her discomfort with it was a feature, not a bug. You don't need the shame. You just need to recover the seriousness, to feel debt as something that has a claim on your future, and to want out of it the way she did, urgently, deliberately, as a thing that doesn't belong in a life you control. It strikes me that she didn't keep all of this to herself. The whole point was to hand it down, which is maybe the part we've lost most completely of all. Trick #18. She taught her kids to earn before they spent. Children in her house didn't simply receive. Long before they understood interest or budgets, they learned the physical sequence at the center of her entire philosophy. The work comes first, then the money, then the thing. You did the chore, you earned the coin, you saved it up, and then, Only then, you bought what you wanted, with money that was already yours. That order got drilled in early, not as a lecture, but as the plain mechanics of how money worked in that household. Earn, then have. Never the reverse. That sequence is exactly what modern life scrambles for a child growing up now. The thing arrives first. Tap the screen. It's at the door tomorrow. And the paying for it floats somewhere in an abstract future they never see land. A generation is learning the reverse of her lesson. Have first, pay later, and never quite feel the connection between the work and the reward. It's not their fault. The whole system is built to hide that connection now. Her fix still works, and it's teachable at any age. Let the earning come before the having, concretely enough that a kid feels it, the saving, the waiting, the deciding whether it's still worth it once the money's finally in hand. That single sequence, learned young, does more to build a lifetime of financial sense than any amount of later advice. She knew it, because she'd learned it the hard way herself. Trick #19. She refused to show off, even when she could afford to. Here's the one that separated her generation from ours most sharply. Even when there was a little money, a good year, a bit set aside, room to splurge, she often didn't. Not because she couldn't, but because spending to impress people struck her as a kind of foolishness, bordering on danger. She'd watched flashy prosperity vanish overnight. She'd learned that the family that looked richest wasn't the family that was safest, and often was exactly the opposite. All show on the surface, nothing underneath when the wind changed. So restraint became a value in itself. The goal wasn't to look prosperous. It was to be secure, and those two things pull in opposite directions more often than we admit. Money spent proving your success to strangers is money that isn't there when you actually need it. She'd rather have the quiet security of savings nobody could see than the visible status of things everybody could. We live inside the exact opposite instinct now, and it's engineered on purpose. Entire industries exist to make us spend money we don't have, to project a prosperity we haven't got, to strangers we'll never meet, on a screen. Her question cuts straight through all of it. Who am I actually buying this for? If the honest answer is, so other people think a certain thing about me, she'd tell you that's the most expensive and least rewarding purchase there is, and the one you'll never miss once you stop making it. Trick #20. She made things last instead of making them new. This is the habit the whole channel is named for, and it was the quiet engine underneath everything else she did with money. The default question in her house wasn't, should I get a new one? It was, how do I keep this one going? A coat got relined, patched, handed down, and worn another decade. A pot got a new handle instead of a replacement. Shoes got resold. When something broke, breaking was the beginning of a repair, not the trigger for a purchase. Making it last wasn't a slogan to her. It was the reflex that sat in front of nearly every spending decision she ever made. And it added up to real money, because a thing that lasts 20 years costs a fraction per year of the same thing, replaced every 2. Durability was a saving strategy disguised as a set of old habits. Every repair was money not spent. Every extra year of use was a purchase that never had to happen. She wasn't being quaint. She was being quietly, relentlessly efficient, with dollars she couldn't afford to waste. We've been moved to the opposite default, without ever agreeing to it. Things are built to be replaced. Repair is priced to feel pointless, and the new version is always one tap away. So, just buy another became the reflex where fix it used to live. Her instinct is worth deliberately rebuilding. Before you replace the next thing that breaks, ask her question first. Can this be fixed, restored, or kept going a while longer? Often it can, and the money you save is as good as money earned, which is the whole idea this channel is built around. Trick #21. She borrowed from neighbors, not banks. When a family genuinely needed help, a short loan to cover a gap, a hand until the next bit of money came in, the first place they turned wasn't a lender, it was each other. Money moved between neighbors and relatives on terms no bank would recognize, often no interest, no contract, sometimes no more record than a handshake and a shared understanding of what was owed. It ran on something banks can't issue: reputation, trust, the knowledge that you'd be seen every day by the person you owed and would help them the same way when their turn came. This wasn't charity, and it wasn't weakness. It was a financial safety net, woven out of relationships instead of institutions, and it kept enormous amounts of hardship from ever reaching a bank or a loan shark. The interest was simply the obligation to be there when the favor ran the other direction. In a decade, when the formal system had failed so many people, this informal one held. Because it was built on bonds the crash couldn't wipe out. We've traded almost all of that away for the convenience of borrowing from strangers at interest. It feels more independent, but it left us more alone and more exposed. A whole generation that would rather owe a credit card than ask a neighbor. You don't have to romanticize the old way to see what we lost. A web of people who show up for each other with real help doesn't just save money, it's worth more than money. Building even a little of that back is one of the most quietly valuable things you can do. That web of trust wasn't only for hard times, though. Sometimes neighbors pooled what they had not to survive a crisis, but to get ahead of one together. Trick #22. She pooled buying power with others. When money was tight, people discovered something that's easy to forget. A group buys better than a person alone. Across the country in the 1930s, families formed buying clubs and consumer cooperatives, pooling their purchasing power to buy food and goods closer to wholesale, cutting out the retail markup none of them could afford. This wasn't a fringe experiment. Membership in consumer cooperatives roughly doubled between 1933 and 1936, and clubs that started in a church basement grew into real operations. The Berkeley Cooperative began with 60 families in 1937 and had grown to 225 families by 1939. The principle underneath it is timeless. Individually, you pay retail and take whatever price you're given. But together, you have leverage, and leverage is what lowers a price. They achieved as a group what none of them could achieve alone: better prices, without needing a scrap of credit to get them. Cooperation was the discount. We shop as isolated individuals now, each of us paying full retail and imagining there's no other way. But her logic still works everywhere you look. Bulk buying splits with neighbors, warehouse memberships shared among families, group orders that unlock wholesale prices. Before you pay retail alone for something a group could buy cheaper, ask whether there's anyone to pool with. The saving was never a trick. It was just people refusing to each pay full price for the same thing separately. Trick #23. She saved in a club that wouldn't let her quit. Here's one that came straight from the banks, the very institutions people distrusted, and it worked precisely because it protected savers from themselves. It was called a Christmas club. You'd deposit a small fixed sum every week all year long, and you couldn't easily pull it out early. The whole design charged you for quitting and paid you at the end, right before the holidays, in one lump you could actually use. First offered back in 1909, these accounts became a genuine mass habit. By the mid-1920s, millions of Americans were saving through them at thousands of banks, and they grew even more popular through the hard years as a way to save for the season without sliding into debt to do it. The genius wasn't the interest, which was small. It was the structure. A Christmas club made saving automatic and quitting painful, which is exactly backwards from how saving usually feels, where saving takes willpower and spending is the easy default. It removed the daily decision entirely. You didn't have to be disciplined 52 times a year. You had to sign up once, and the structure carried you. That's a lesson worth stealing wholesale. Willpower fails, structure doesn't. The modern version is a separate savings account with an automatic weekly transfer you set once and leave alone. Same principle, better tools. Set it up so saving happens without you, and quitting takes effort, and you'll save more by accident than you ever managed on purpose. She knew the secret wasn't being stronger than temptation. It was building a system where temptation never got a vote. Trick #24. She paid with skill when she couldn't pay with cash. We touched barter earlier, but there's a specific version worth naming on its own, because it's the one most within your reach today. When she couldn't pay for something with money, she paid for it with what she could do. A man patched a neighbor's roof in exchange for a share of that family's canned goods. A woman took in sewing or mending and was paid in eggs, in vegetables, in a cut of a slaughtered hog. The blacksmith accepted potatoes. Skill became currency, and unlike cash, it was a currency the depression couldn't take away from you, because it lived in your own two hands. That's the part worth holding on to. Money can vanish, in a bank failure, a layoff, a bad year. But a real skill is a form of wealth nobody can foreclose on. The person who could fix, build, sew, cook, or grow always had something to trade, always had a way to get what they needed, even when the dollars weren't there. Their ability was their reserve account, and it never closed its doors. We've specialized ourselves into a corner where most of us can do exactly one thing and pay strangers for everything else. It's efficient right up until the income stops, and then the helplessness is total. Her world points at the fix. Every practical skill you build is money you won't have to spend, and a thing you can trade when cash is short. Learn to do one more thing yourself this year. It pays you back for the rest of your life. Trick #25. She kept every record because she'd learned not to trust them. The last habit is the one born most directly from the wound. When the banks failed, it wasn't only money that vanished. For many families, so did the trust that any institution would keep an honest account of what was theirs. So they became the keepers of their own records. Every receipt saved, every payment noted, every important paper held onto, filed and protected. Because she had learned, in the hardest way there is, that the only record you can fully rely on is the one you keep yourself. It looks like mere thrift shop pack rat habit until you understand where it came from. It was self-defense. If the institution's ledger could fail you, could simply lose your life savings and shrug, then your own careful paper trail was the only proof that could never be taken away. Documentation was power. It was the ability to say, with evidence in hand, this is what I paid, this is what I'm owed, this is what is mine. We've drifted far from that, trusting that some server somewhere holds an accurate history of our financial lives, accessible forever, never wrong. Mostly it does. But her instinct still protects you in a world of billing errors, disputed charges, subscriptions that quietly renew, and accounts that don't add up. Keep your own records. Know your own numbers. Never be in the position of having to simply trust that someone else got it right, because the day they don't, the person with the receipts is the person who wins. And that's the 25. Here's what I keep coming back to, having walked through all of them. Maybe we don't need to go back to 1935. Maybe we don't want to. It was a hard, frightening, often cruel decade, and nobody living through it would trade our comfort for their fear. That's not the point of any of this. The point is smaller and quieter than that. Maybe we just don't need to throw quite so much away. Maybe we could keep a little more of our money where we can see it. Pay for a few more things before we own them. Fix one thing that breaks instead of replacing it. And stop confusing what looks like security for the thing itself. She didn't have these habits because she was better than us. She had them because life taught her, brutally, what happens when you don't. And then that lesson got lost somewhere between her kitchen table and ours. The good news is that lessons can be found again. Every one of these is still here, still working, still waiting to be picked back up. If any of this landed, do me a favor and let me know you're out there. Like this video, and subscribe if you want more of these, because this whole channel is about finding what we lost and putting it back to use. And if you haven't seen it yet, watch the one right before this. Why Depression-era kids had a work ethic nobody sees today. The money habits in this video and the work habits in that one grew from the very same soil. You'll see exactly how they fit together. But before you go, I want to hear from you. Of these 25, which one did your own family still practice? The coffee can, the garden, the receipts, the refusal to owe anyone. Tell me in the comments which habit you grew up with, or which one you're going to try. I read them, and I'd love to know which piece of this you're carrying forward.